Well, this is a great honor for me because I'm here with someone who I find extremely inspiring, with Isa Gucciardi, who is the founder of the Sacred Stream in San Francisco. Isa holds degrees and certificates in transpersonal psychology, in cultural and linguistic anthropology, in comparative religion and hypnotherapy, transformational healing. She has been also a dedicated Buddhist practitioner for over 40 years, and she spent over 30 years studying spiritual, therapeutic, and meditative techniques from around the world. She's worked with master teachers of Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Sufism, as well as expert shamanic practitioners from a variety of traditions. And one of the things that I find so personally compelling about Isa is that she brings together a certain academic rigor with an extremely deep practitioner's perspective. And this is something that I really appreciate. Thank you for being here with us, Isa.
Thank you for having me.
So to begin, I want to give everybody just sort of a sketch. I'd like for you to give us a sketch of the kind of work that you do. Your work covers a wide spectrum of influences, as I just mentioned. You're working with shamanism, you're working with Buddhism, you're working with transpersonal psychology. You're doing this in a clinical context, as well as a philosophical and spiritual one. You have this unusual ability to integrate the wisdom of these traditions into a clear and compelling vision of the human condition and how to work with it. So I wanted to start by asking you, is there an overarching question that you've been pursuing, over the decades that sort of guided you along this very multiform path?
Well, I think the overarching question of my life formed very early on, and it has certainly informed my work now. And I think it was sort of the beginning of my work. I was very, very young. I had the good fortune to live in the Pacific, in the Hawaiian Islands, when I was young. And as you may know, having perhaps been there, Hawaii is a very compelling place in terms of the natural world. And I spent most of my time, if not all of my time, outside. And I loved being with the sea, with the winds, with the plants. And the reason that I felt so compelled to be with them was because everything in nature seemed to be in harmony, and everything seemed to have a place, and everything had so much beauty. And when I was with human beings, it was quite the opposite. There was a lot of strife, a lot of unhappiness. And I kept thinking, here's the question: how do we bring the beauty and the harmony of nature into the human experience? How do we find a way for humans to be able to match this harmony and this beauty in their interactions with themselves and with each other? And that was the beginning of my quest. And if I look back over all of my education, that was always the question. When I was studying different cultures, I was looking for a culture that accurately reflected the harmony of nature. When I was studying religions, I was trying to find a religion that accurately reflected the peace and insight that nature provided. So it's an overarching question. And as I'm in the clinical setting now with so many of my clients, and when I'm in the classroom with so many of my students, it's still the question: how do we bring peace to this person? How do we work with the powers of nature And how do we work with the insights that lie in that ground luminosity and bring them into this person's experience in a way that they can access and in a way that makes sense to them. And that's what depth hypnosis is all about. The spiritual counseling model that I developed is how do we do that? And it has lots and lots and lots of techniques for doing that.
Thank you so much. So yeah, depth hypnosis is an absolutely fascinating model that Isa's developed. And one of the things that really resonated with me were some of the parallels between Hatha yoga and that model. Now, one of them, which you sort of started to touch upon in your generous answer to that last question, was about this sense of spirituality as having something to do with a connection to the earth, and then a sort of corresponding sort of alienation in the modern experience, or even a certain disorientation, I think, for many of us, on account of that sense of alienation from the natural world and from the sort of the wisdom of that field. So I've heard you say in a number of places that we've lost connection to the earth, and that this might be the sort of one of the defining conditions of our sort of spiritual disorientation. So I was just wondering if you would talk a little bit more about that connection.
The connection with the earth?
The connection with the earth as defining our sort of spiritual disorientation.
Oh, the lack of connection with it.
The lack of connection.
Right. If we were connected to the earth, there would be no problems. I mean, I'm sure there would be problems, but well, I mean, I think that, I think that's really interesting, the way that people take the earth for granted, and not only that but there has been an active war waged against it for the last, several thousand years of human experience, at least, wherein there is this, idea that, the earth's resources are there to consume. The other creatures here on the planet are here to dominate. That, we know that we are here, that everything is here serving us as human beings. And I think that there's another way to look at things, which is, I believe, having spent most of my adult life very much engaged in trying to understand, in my earlier life, even before I was an adult, trying to understand the nature of this incredible creative power that the earth is. And I think that there's been this effort to kind of dominate that power or harness that power for ends that have nothing to do with her priorities. And I really think, I just finished one book called The New Return to the Great Mother, which is a reissuing it's a second edition of the book, The Return to the Great Mother, which is a book about the power of the great feminine that resides in the creative power of the earth, that birthing women need to understand and cultivate a relationship with in order to be able to birth in as a powerful and creative way as possible. And then I'm writing another book right now on Tara, the goddess of Buddhist philosophy and also Hindu philosophy, who is also a mother goddess. It's one of her many manifestations. And this idea of mothering, this idea of matriarchy, this idea of caring, of having a culture that is based in caring and caretaking. I think when you find these matriarchies and that have existed and that are very much toward the priority of the earth in the way that the cultural norms seek to be sure that there's a even distribution of economic goods, that there's a consensus making among all of the different members of the group, where the main priority in setting social and political and familial and spiritual goals is in that everyone is taken care of. And this is, if I were, I'm one interpreter of, and one observer of the power of the earth. But if I were to try to distill all of the many facets that she offers and demonstrates to us in terms of creative power, I think the essence, the distillation, is the sense of care. And we tend to forget that every breath we take is supported and offered by the earth.
Mm.
And, for those of you that are studying yoga, you are becoming a student of the earth through your study of breath, in so many ways. And I think that that reconnection through the breath, through yoga, is a wonderful way to enter into that connection with the earth again, when you have that understanding in mind that she is actually providing you with that breath.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in depth hypnosis, which is so much a dedication, it's an anthem, it's a hymn to the earth. And that hymn is sung through the way that shamanic practices inform depth hypnosis, because one of the first things that we do in the session work, in the clinical setting, is we help people connect with what we call a part of themselves that has only their highest good as its sole intent. And this idea is born from this connection with the earth that in shamanism is often manifested or demonstrated through a connection with the unseen powers of the earth that are often called a helping spirit or a guide or a teacher. And it's through the mentorship of this aspect of the self in depth hypnosis, which is expressed again as a helping spirit in shamanic practice, that one retrains themselves or entrains themselves into a connection with the sense of care, the sense of loving, the sense of caretaking, the sense of nurturing, that this part of the self that has so much love and concern and care for us has. And so many of us are completely disconnected from that. And it's so painful to see people who have been informed by religious orthodoxy, liturgical ideas of being born in sin, or familial value systems where people receive the message that, I wish you hadn't been born, or, too bad you're here. These kinds of messages that people receive and of course the culture now, the dominant culture, has almost nothing to do with the earth. There's no touchstone. It's all focused on something else. And so having this way of connecting with this nurturing power of the earth immediately in the clinical setting, and having that be the primary relationship that a person has as they are moving through all of the places of disconnection and all of their symptoms. And from my perspective, everyone's symptoms, whether it's depression, anxiety, autoimmune problem, eating disorder, PTSD, these are all a function of disconnection from the earth. And they're all a function of the way in which we have fundamentally disconnected from that core creative power that the earth provides us with every breath. And so depth hypnosis is all about the recovery of that connection.
So beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. That resonated with me so much, and I'm sure that it's really going to resonate with a lot of other Hatha yoga practitioners who, in this particular program, especially, we are indeed considering the breath as a fundamental relationship of reciprocity with the earth, as a sort of continuous, very deeply intimate interchange with all other beings and all other energies. And it's my sincere hope that through the way that we connect to the breath, we connect to that part of ourselves that we can trust, that part of ourselves that nourishes us, that cares for us, that gives the gift of life to us so generously in every single moment. Now, when I came to yoga, I came out of a sense of total disorientation and depression. Actually, I was depressed and did not want to go the route of meds, and was willing to try anything, even something as absolutely absurd as yoga. So I had no idea, that it was going to draw me in so deeply. But my own sort of journey, which I'm not going to get into it much here, but it was very much about reconnecting to this sense of a feminine nurturing spirit inside of myself, that through which I was able to start to have real self-compassion, which I never actually experienced, at least from my sort of teenage years onward, until I was 30 years old. But I'm wondering how do we lose that? If it's, if our breath is being given to us as a gift, if this gift is being given so continuously, if the earth is continuously offering up its fruits in such abundance to sustain the lives of our bodies and minds, how do we lose connection with that sort of fundamental existential fact, such that we fail to feel internally supported, fail to feel internally loved and accepted and cared for? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I got nothing but thoughts on that. Well, I think there's a couple of different ways to approach that question. One is the culture that we're living in has nothing to do with nature. The cultural norms have no priority in terms of maintaining the ecology. The whole idea is it's a very, hierarchical set of cultures that are dominant on the planet right now, where domination over another, domination over all of the aspects of the earth, domination over other people, or the priority. And then any other priorities get pushed aside, and there is a fundamental lack of connection that happens then, and one is not really able to feel or able to be aware of anything other than the values that feed this priority. And that's, on a cultural level, that's what happens. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, within the cultural overarching experience you have within families, you have people who have been parented by people who were badly parented. People who had lost connection with their own internal resources and are now parenting, and the next generation has even fewer relationships with their internal resources. And so you have this kind of cascading disconnection kind of moving through the generations. And I've seen this within my own lifetime. When I was born, there were, the elders had been born in the previous century. And I was always interested in old people. I always loved being around old people. And so I spent a lot of time, whenever I could, sidle up to an old person and have a conversation with them, I would. And, they would talk about, I remember they would talk about being on the planet before there was telephones. They would talk about, being, walking behind the horse with the plow, setting the fields for the coming season. They would talk about these things that, people had completely, even in that time, in the mid 50s, when I was up and around and talking, people had forgotten about them. And that had only been 60 years before, and, now, and I keep thinking, and I always thought, boy, that must be so amazing for these old people to have been on the planet, to have seen this change. And now I'm an old person on the planet, and I've seen 10,000 times more change, and much more change than they ever saw. And the change has been away from the earth in a very profound way, and much more toward disorder. I mean, in over the course of my lifetime, the dominance of this disordered mentality that comes out of Hollywood, out of the computer game makers, this focus on violence, this focus on chaos. This is something that did not exist before in this way. And that is a very powerful force of disconnection. People are caught in that. And I see, as I'm teaching my students how to do depth hypnosis, and they bring me their cases, because I still work in the clinical setting, but I don't follow cases over time. I do one-time consults to help people map where they're going, and then I turn them over to one of my practitioners that I've trained. And the thing that I see, and people bring me their, I do a lot of case supervision, and I do a lot of teaching. I'm trying to, from the beginning with depth hypnosis, it was always a matter of trying to teach as many people as I could how to do this, because I could not keep up with the caseload. And still, even now, I mean, I'm so grateful that we have so many practitioners studying, because we have such an influx of people into the model. But the thing that I see through this influx, I read the case studies, and I'm always disturbed by the level of disorder. It is increased exponentially, even in the 30 years since I started practicing. It's really increasing. And we really need things like your program slowing this down and helping people get reordered. Because that chaos and that disorder is a total function of lack of connection with the earth and with nature and with beauty and with harmony. It's not even a value. It's not even something that's considered important. And so having, so wonderful. I mean, you said you had 100 people in this class. I'm so happy that you do, because those 100 people, as they order themselves and as they find their own way back to connection, they will be in a position to help others do the same. And this is so important. And one of the things that I say to my students all the time is we cannot lose heart. We have to work hard. We have to be that counterforce to chaos. And we have to, and the way that we do that is by ordering ourselves and taking that learning and helping others order themselves. And we have the earth as our teacher that we can always come back to. She will always inspire us, always provide us with a model.
She doesn't recoil.
No.
She doesn't, she hasn't yet judged us harshly.
Maybe she should. I'm just joking. I'm joking. What's the matter with her?
2,000-year tantrum we've been throwing.
Right. No, it's true. There's this engagement and, continuous transformation in response to whatever's happening.
I heard you talk recently in an interview. I forget which one it was. They sort of run together for me, but you were talking about, I bet, I can only imagine. You're very busy in the best possible way. But you were speaking very optimistically about the new sort of welcoming of somatic practices, of spiritually oriented practices, of practices that and therapeutic approaches that sort of may help us connect more to this nourishing earthy energy into conventional medicine, into conventional medical settings. Can you that's a nice optimistic reflection. Would you mind telling us sort of what you see as someone who's been watching this for decades?
Well, yeah, and thank you for bringing that forward. I didn't mean to like be a big downer.
No.
Sorry, I'm just trying to like inspire people to, toward the good by talking about the bad. Maybe that's not always the way to do it. Maybe we should talk about the good. Well, one thing that I would say, and what I was probably saying in that interview is this opening toward even entertaining the idea. Like, I know at this point for people, who have been born in the last 40 years, it doesn't seem odd, but I can promise you, when I first started practicing, the idea that you might say there's a connection between the mind and the body was absolute heresy. And the fact that you might say that it was possible to work with the body to heal the mind, or the fact that you might say that the body was the holder of wisdom that could be accessed through hypnosis or through some other altered state process to heal the mind was absolute heresy. I mean, I had mentors of mine say, be careful, shh, be quiet, don't talk about doing anything to do with the shamanic journey as anything to do with therapy. It's like, are you kidding me? This is all therapeutic, but everybody was so afraid of the APA and the AMA coming down on them. And of course, with good measure, I mean, because, the midwives had all been run out of town within the last 100 years. And, there was a real hegemony of practitioners that really did not want people practicing medicine without a license, unquote. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. You need to have standards, but you also have to have an open mind, and you have to also understand that there's many types of medicine. And so that has happened. There's much more. And now we have, I was around when they were shutting down all the LSD experiments as people's minds were being opened, right? And now we have Johns Hopkins. Hey, psilocybin helps people as they're dying. Oh, what do you know? Hey, let's do some experiments and prove that, because shamans have been doing that for 3,000 years, 4,000 years, 5,000 years. We've known this, this is something that's known. But how wonderful. I mean, I'm being a little facetious here, but on the other hand, I do really appreciate the scientific rigor that is brought to it with these experiments at Johns Hopkins, where they are helping people who have received fatal diagnosis. And of course, anyone in that position really needs a lot of help. And most people need much more help than they could have ever imagined, because our culture doesn't help you, educate you about dying. And people don't spend their lives in a spiritual practice understanding that the way that they are living is going to inform the way that they're dying. There's this terrible, terrible lack of education. So how wonderful the scientific community has begun to listen to the plants, and how wonderful that they are bringing the resources of the plants into a structure within the culture that can accept this help. Because many people would not be able to accept that help if it did not have the scientific stamp of approval, right? They wouldn't know how. And so this is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. And it's unimaginable. 30 years ago, that would have been unimaginable that this would have been happening. And so I think that, and I can't, now these days in my classes, I have so many psychotherapists, so many psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, doctors. I have so many people that are coming to the classes to try to learn. And I have UC Berkeley who asked me to come every year to give a lecture to their pre-med students about alternative therapies. This is wonderful.
Yeah,
This
amazing.
is fabulous, you know?
So I was wondering if we could take the conversation there for just a moment, because although, we're starting to look sort of more positively at, the way that society might be starting to revalue a connection with the earth and spirituality. I think it's one of the things that we're doing in this course is trying to look very closely at our own psychology and realize the various ways that disconnection from the earth takes shape in our own minds. The way that the different values such as aggression, competitiveness, different forms of subtle violence have been sort of absorbed into us, the way that we have absorbed those, and the way that we sort of reiterate the behavioral patterns that give them expression, and the way so that we sort of rationalize and paper over that to ourselves and keep that sort of hidden from view. So one of the concepts that, and I'm sorry, this is way too long-winded of a question, but one of the concepts that I know you work with a lot and that we are working with in this course is the Jungian concept of the shadow. And I think that these, various ways in which we are violent and aggressive, as obvious and sort of out in the air as they may be, are things that I think most of us put in our shadow by various means of rationalization. So I was wondering if you would speak to that, tell us a little bit about the Jungian idea of the shadow and the way that rationalization sort of helps to hold things in the shadow, and what kinds of alienating behaviors might be illuminated by us if we begin to look into the shadow.
Well, I have two ways of answering that question. Of course, I don't know if you know, but I spent a lot of years at the Institut Catholique de Paris studying in the 70s. And at that time, it was a hotbed of Jungian foment. And Marie-Louise von France, one of Jung's most celebrated students, was teaching there at that time. And so I got to study with her. And it was interesting because the program that I was in had a lot of Catholic missionaries that had come back to the motherland, to, continue their education and study, but they just had nothing but interesting stories and information about all the different spiritual practices in the colonies, right? These were all shamanic practices. And so there was all this big discussion about, Jung and the shadow and the universal unconsciousness, understanding through this shamanic view, right? And I've always said, having spent those years there, I've always said that the only difference between Freud and Jung is shamanism, right? Because, I think he developed all of his universal unconscious ideas through shamanic exposure. He did a tour of the colonies, and it was through all of that. I'm using that word, the colonies, from his perspective, from that time. I'm not, I know that, now that's not a correct way to refer to anything or anyone, but that's how they were referring to this information at the time. So I'm using that language. I'm just translating it. It was Carl Jung's exposure to shamanic principles that really helped him, I believe, develop the universal unconscious. So I think that there's an information there. But in terms of the shadow, I think that I would like to address that from a slightly different point of view, which is a Buddhist point of view. And from a Buddhist point of view, we are all going through lifetime after lifetime, incarnating, impelled by our karmic patterns. And our karmic patterns are ways of cycling energy that either bring us closer to our essential nature, which in Buddhism is expressed as Buddha nature, or further away from it. And mostly karmic patterns hide or obscure our Buddha nature, that essential aspect of the self that is connected to the ground luminosity, which infuses all the forms of nature. And so these karmic patterns are developed over time through lack of awareness. And in becoming aware and encountering consciousness, which in Buddhism is expressed as encountering the Dharma, one becomes aware of the way in which one's karmic patterns, one's way of cycling energy through negative emotions, aggressive emotions, or through other types of emotions, or through other types of intentionality, negative intentionality, or mixed intentionality. These are the patterns that are generated on an energetic level that then become imprints that move us from lifetime to lifetime. And this is something that we look into extensively in the Applied Buddhist Psychology program and in the energy medicine, integrated energy medicine program here at the Sacred Stream. We look at this dynamic. But I would say, in terms of the shadow work, that it really is a matter of maturation. And that in order to be able to embrace the shadow, there's a certain level of maturity that one has to attain or strive for. And sometimes that can just begin with the desire to be free of suffering. Because, from a Buddhist perspective, we're all caught in this place of samsara, which is this place of interacting with the world, with each other, with ourselves, from this lack of awareness about the effect of how our attachments, competition, our aversions, hatred, and pushing away, and misunderstandings, the earth is there to be used, affect our experience. And so the idea in Buddhism is to take refuge away from the effect of the suffering that is created in that way. And then to begin to mature one's point of view through spiritual development and through the dismantling of those attachments and those aversions. And that's why you have, very early on in the practice, you have this practice of equanimity, where you're trying to really iron out all of your attachments and aversions and get to a place where you're not acting in order to dominate or avoid something, or you're not attached to having things be a particular way, and where you're willing to open your mind to see, oh, maybe I misunderstood something, right? And so that loosens the grip of the karmic patterns. And it also makes the karmic patterns very evident once you've taken refuge and once you begin to listen to your mind. And I'm sure that's something that you're doing in your yoga practices, where you're really trying to listen to your mind, where you're doing that shamatha practice, that breath practice, where all you're doing is listening to the breath. And again, what that does is it makes evident, the first thing that a new meditator, and I'm sure all of your students have felt this, the first thing you notice is you try to listen to your breath is all the things that are trying to keep you from listening to your breath. You should have done that. No, you didn't do that. You did do, right? Like getting all that to lie down, right? And so in doing that process, that maturation process, that evolution toward greater understanding of one's relationship with one's own Buddha nature, which again is a relationship with the ground luminosity of the earth that infuses all the forms of the earth. Then you become aware of these aspects of yourself, and you have, in depth hypnosis, we're very, very specific about connecting people with this realization of the connection with the earth, through that part of the self that has only the highest good, or through a connection with the guide in the form of nature, so that one can sustain understanding how one's behavior, one's attachments, one's aversions, and one's misknowings have created their own suffering. And so within depth hypnosis, you come to this realization, and then you have all of these tools to help dissolve those karmic patterns by shifting the way that the energy moves within the person's mind body complex, by working with that sustenance, that part of the self that has only one's highest good as its sole intent, and sailing into the areas of the psyche that have traditionally been called of the shadow by Jungians, that have been problematic. Often it's traumatic experience, or often it's experience that we have not wanted to own in some way for some reason. And we move into that, and we shift the person's relationship to that experience, which then initiates this unwinding of the way in which the shadow is energetically held aside within the psyche, and begins to incorporate and integrate that experience into the larger self, so that the shadow diminishes and the authentic self can rest in an untraumatized and whole way. And I think the Buddhist perspective there, in terms of, in terms of how it informs depth hypnosis, is probably the most helpful. Because one of the things that I have found, I mean, I have studied Jung a lot, and I appreciate all of his contributions, but he can get a little heady. And there's not a lot of practical, like, dismantling of the shadow. There's like a lot of description of it, and a lot of talking about it, and a lot of analysis of it. But in terms of actually the dissolution of it, I think Buddhism provides a little bit better map for that. And but again, it's not that I don't appreciate. I think Carl Jung is a very important theorist, and very important to understand his work. And this concept of the shadow, and the different aspects of the self, I think that he has articulated are very, very important in terms of self-understanding. Very important model, very important paradigm that I think your students can definitely benefit from understanding.
Would you say that I have a question about the relationship between the Buddhist psychology that you just described and this Jungian idea of the shadow? Would you say that the shadow includes just all of the parts of the self, all of those karmic patterns, these ways of sort of cycling energy through negative emotions, insofar as we have inadequate awareness of them, or insofar as we even sort of see them through a distorted lens? In other words, we rationalize. Most of us don't think of ourselves as being aggressive and violent, although when we go further into, when we start to do meditative practice, I think for many of us, this is a heartbreaking experience, that we go through of realizing the extent of our aggression.
Yeah.
So would you say that is an apt characterization of the shadow as applied to the Buddhist paradigm?
Yeah, I think the shadow, when Carl Jung talks about it, he talks about the aspect of the self that one is unaware of, either by commission or by omission. That's my word. But either you're actively denying, you're actively suppressing, you're actively repressing, or you're just out to lunch. And all of them, they all have different effects. All of those different methods of trying to separate some aspect of the self that one doesn't want to embrace. They all have different, like the effect that denial has, as opposed to active suppression, as opposed to simple repression. Like all of those have different effects within the psyche that need to be repaired, but all of them have, they all have lack of awareness as a common denominator, either, again, through an act of will or simply through ignorance. And the idea from a Buddhist point of view, the nature of samsara is one, it is that it is characterized by ignorance. We don't understand who we are. We don't understand what we, what the effects are or the consequences of our actions are. And certainly from a Jungian point of view, no one gets that when you put something in the shadow, when you try to separate from it, it will run your life, and that is very much a definition of samsara. Anything you're trying to move away from, anything you're trying to separate yourself from will bind you to it. And any activity to deny or separate from something or to create a kind of duality binds you to the opposite. And so that absolutely happens. I mean, Carl Jung describes that. I mean, he says that whatever you put in the shadow will run your life. So better to get it, I always say, it's difficult. I'm thinking of this conversation I had with a student many years ago, where she was, I'll have to tell you the story because it's illustrative. So she's talking to me and she's saying, Isa, this depth hypnosis stuff really sucks. She goes, I can't stand it. I see all these bad things about myself. There's all these things that I really don't want to know. I can't just watch TV all day, because I know I got all this I got to do, and I really can't deal with this. What are you doing to me? And I'm like, so she goes on and on and on like this for a while, just, fomenting about her shadow, right? And so I let her go on and on and on. And then I look at her and I say, welcome to higher consciousness. I was not the most popular girl with her for a while, but that is the nature of it, right? It's like, oh boy. But then you set about dismantling it. And depth hypnosis, if depth hypnosis is nothing else, it is a process of dissolving karmic patterns. And people feel absolutely liberated. Absolutely, people's lives change as they understand the consequences of their actions, as they understand the implications and the ill-advised nature of repressing the shadow and embrace it. But people need resources. They need this inner connection. They need an environment, a container that helps them move through those issues that are generating the shadow, or that are creating the conditions for the shadow, in a way that is supported, that is held, where they are cared for, whereas there's sense of compassion, this nurturing, this matriarchal, this mothering, this caretaking. That is the essence of the earth. And that is the environment that is generated within the depth hypnosis process, so that all of this pain, all of this agony, all of this trauma that are driving people's patterns that they're trying to separate from by putting them in the shadow can be brought forward and transformed in a way that is catalytic, that is dynamic, but that is doable, that is slowed down, that is not traumatizing, and that allows for integration. And I think that combining these different ways of looking at the self, taking this Jungian idea of the shadow, taking the Buddhist understandings about the spiritual evolution and the maturity that it provides, bringing the resources of the earth and all of the healing practices of shamanism into the hypnotherapeutic process of depth hypnosis, where people are working in an altered state. They're working beyond the defenses of the conscious mind, and they are able to resolve the energetic patterns, the karmic patterns that are driving their symptoms. And so they can heal, right?
It's such a compelling and inspiring vision of what healing is.
Yes.
A question that arises for me, especially in your last description of it, is because that description was so focused on the sort of maternal power and the healing potency of that. What is the role of masculinity?
Oh, the whole catalytic process. That whole catalytic process, you have to have that kind of forward motion where you're moving in, like you're going in, like your whole, you have this container of the feminine, but then you have this incisive, focus and courage and willingness to go into the heart of any negativity, into the heart of any manifestation, into the heart of any trauma. And that is a very masculine thing. And it's a very important thing. And it's certainly in no way do I ever want anyone to feel that there's any kind of minimalization of the masculine in this model or in anything. I just think that there's a real, I think that the masculine has gotten a little bit colonized by too much of a good, it's not a good thing. It's got the concepts of the masculine: protection, courage, the ability to stand, the ability to catalyze, the ability to bring progress, the ability to move things forward. This is the masculinity. This is the important masculine that is so important to all progress and to all types of transformation. It's so important. But it has become, these qualities have become a little bit distorted. That's the word I'm looking for, distorted in our modern time. And because there's too much of an emphasis on working with those qualities for personal gain, or for, that is not in tune with the collective or in tune with what the individual needs, right? So absolutely, I totally embrace the masculine. And I know a lot of my students will often, the further you go with me into my teaching, the more military I get. It's like everybody's going to go, who is this? And it's like, we have to be disciplined. We have to have courage. We have to move forward. We can't flinch away from this. We have to, and it's like, that really comes forward the deeper you go into the work, because you have to have those qualities in order to be able to confront the crushing effect of unconsciousness and negativity. You have to be able to develop that in order to be able to face it down, right?
Thank you so much. Maybe I can ask you one more question. We're just about at our time here, but I would love to hear you say something about the way that we hold these various modes of. Well, you said that the common denominator of the various modes of sort of holding things in the shadow was a lack of awareness. And I was wondering about how that lack of awareness and the presence of these, these sort of unintegrated psychical materials impact what we think of as the body in sort of conventional, ordinary language. I know that depth hypnosis is a very somatically oriented practice, and we haven't even touched on the techniques. But of course, hatha yoga, the kind of yoga that we're doing, is also very somatically oriented. I would say that that in some ways it's an advantage, and in some ways it's a disadvantage. That hatha yoga is very minimal on philosophy and theory. It borrows its psychology. from all kinds of different sources. But I'm wondering, of course, in our technique, I do find, of course, obviously, I believe in Hatha Yoga as an extraordinarily potent technique for moving energy through the body, and so helping sort of interrupt these karmic patterns and possibly, even dissolve them, reshape them, diminish them, etc. But I was wondering if you would tell us something about the way that we hold our karmic patterns in our body, the way that we experience, the way that we might experience them, and if you wanted to get specific about, denial, suppression, repression, any of those sort of, different modes of lack of awareness, or different modes of sort of of refusing to recognize in some way, and the way that those manifest in the body. That would be amazing.
Okay, sure. So, well, first of all, I think it's important to, again, I have several different ways of coming at that question. I think that it's really important to understand that the body is the holder of all memory, and that the body has its own intelligence that is elemental and deep, and that is completely ignored and abused by conscious mind reality. And it's a real problem because, the body is just seen as this thing that has to look a particular way and do a particular thing in order to support the priorities and the intentionality of a will from the mind that is focused toward winning, or, as you're saying, domination or competition, right? And so the body is lost, right? So it's so important to have this work that you're doing coming back to becoming a student of the body. And within the body, it's important to remember that the body is a physical manifestation of an energetic set of patterns. And that's why it's so important that with yoga that you are exploring these energy centers of the central channel, the side channels, the chakras, the aura, these energetic experiences that are the underpinnings of and drive the manifestation of the physical body. And of course, the physical body informs what happens within the energy system. It's a two-way street. It's not just one-way street. But in terms of the karmic patterns being stored within the body, and the body manifesting those physical patterns, manifesting those karmic patterns physically, it begins on the energetic level, because karmic patterns are energy patterns. And so in terms of, what kind of and we see a little bit of this description with genetics and now with epigenetics, this recognition that things are happening on the physical level as a result of things that are happening at these more subtle levels. And we're also seeing, with books like Beyond, we see with Groff's work, Beyond the Brain, we see the biology of belief, we see the genie in your genes, all of these, Candace Perk's work on the molecules of emotion. We see all of this work understanding the relationship between the subtle experience on a biochemical level and energetic level, and its relationship with things happening on a physical experience. So, and from a Buddhist perspective, the seed consciousness that in some Buddhist schools moves from lifetime to lifetime is holding all of the karmic patterns that then become manifest in the energetic body, that then drives the experiences in the physical body. So, and we see that even within one lifetime, you know, we don't have to look across lifetimes to see, like, for instance, you have in homeopathy, you have this understanding of miasms that are traveling across not only generations, but also the generations of the expression of that one particular person, where you have a miasm, a physical miasm of, well, you have gonorrhea, you have syphilis, you have cancer, you have these different disorders that are held within the miasm, within the person and within the generations of people that they're part of biologically, that are traveling along in this subtle body. And you have all of the different homeopathic remedies that are designed on the energetic level to resolve the person's relationship with those miasms in order to resolve the physical manifestations that are a function of those energetic connections. Mm. So for instance, I'm an intermediate homeopath. I would love to be a much more accomplished homeopath, but I could give you case studies, but anyway, it would take a little bit long to set it up. But you can have a physical manifestation. Like, for instance, I'll just give you a quick one. There's one case that I worked with under the supervision of someone else, was this recurring mastitis, infection of the breast, recurring after the birth of a child, kept recurring. And it turns out that this particular type of physical manifestation is syphilitic in terms of the constitution, having this miasm of syphilis within the person's own energetic generational experience and their biological experience with other people. So then you have to use treatments in order to resolve the recurring mastitis that's happening on the physical level. You have to address the energetic expression of syphilis with a particular remedy that is going to resolve it on the spirit level, and then the manifestation on the physical level will go away. So that's how homeopathy works, right?
Amazing.
So then in terms of, and you're talking about in terms of repressed emotions, in terms of shadows, let me give you an example within a lifetime. So we're talking like arch of lifetimes, but within the depth hypnosis environment, I work a lot with physical problems. And a common physical problem that people have is a migraine headache they can't find any kind of physical reason for it, and yet they're the recurring and nobody knows why. Okay, so almost always and what we do in depth hypnosis is we go into the body, we help the person alter their state of awareness and help them focus their breath into the place where the manifestation in this case of the physical problem is, and we have them basically do holotropic breathing, which is something that Stan Grof developed, where you're going deeply, and I imagine you do that with prana yoga. You're going pranayama with your hatha yoga. I'm sure it's the same thing, where you would breathe deeply into this to see what emerges on the out breath. And so almost always with migraines, when you're breathing into the place of the pain with the migraine, you will almost always get some strong emotion emerging and some strong set of circumstances that the person is repressing, that they don't want to know about, some kind of abuse or trauma, or often a desire to harm another, hatred, these strong emotions that are held there in the physical pain. And they would rather physicalize them rather than express them on the emotional level. And from a depth hypnosis point of view, we understand that if you have a disruption on a spirit level and you don't deal with it, it will go to the mental level. And if you have a disruption on the mental level, it will go to the emotional level. And if you don't deal with it there, it will then move from the emotional level to the physical level. And so this process of going into the physical pain where it's stored in the body moves back that continuum, and they begin to see the emotions that are driving the physical pain, and they begin to see the conceptualizations that are driving the physical pain, and then they begin to see and understand the imbalance on the level of spirit that is generating all of that negative conceptualization, negative emotion, and suppression into the shadow. And in depth hypnosis, we unwind all that. And so I've helped so many people come out of a migraine pattern, with that kind of thing. So there's an example.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I said that I was asking you my last question, but I just want to end by asking you one more thing. It's about our sort of loss in this society of elders, that is of older people who are holders of wisdom that cannot be accessed but through through experience, through long periods of study and long periods of relating and contemplating and practicing. And I think one of the things that struck me about you when I very first came across you, which was at Menla about a year and a half ago, it was now, my wife had come to study shamanism with you, as she continues to do. But I recognized immediately that you sort of embody this archetype of the sagacious elder, and this is extremely rare nowadays. I find it sort of woefully rare, and I know that is an extremely important part of traditional. Of the traditional way in which wisdom is passed down through the ages. And I'm wondering if you could say something about the sort of loss I mean, if you agree with me that there's this phenomenon that in this day and age, in our modern society, we have fewer, perhaps sort of recognized, sagacious elders to turn to. Many of us, at least, have to really seek them out, that we don't tend to just sort of have them, in our family or in our village or whatever. So I wonder if you could say something, if you agree with me that that's a phenomenon, that sort of, what's behind it, and what can we do to recover it?
Well, I think we have a culture that values youth, right? And so anything that's not youth is not valued. And I think that a lot of people have this idea that getting older is a problem. And so they don't embrace it. They try to, have facelifts and tummy tucks and this and that, and, focus themselves into youthful activities, and, they tend to try to participate in, at the age of 50, and, in things that people at the age of 30 are engaging in, right? So there's this lack of understanding about the cyclical nature of experience. And I think that there really is a devaluation of wisdom. That this isn't something that's valued in the culture. What's valued is how quick you can pick up technology, how quick you can, make it look like, the technology is doing something fancy that never was done before, but has actually been done 1,000 other times before in an easier way, as far as I can tell. And, the other problem with technology that I find is that, and the value system that values technology, is that technology is always changing. And so the wisdom that you gain in learning a particular technological system is lost. Right. Because then there's another one that comes, and everything you knew before is gone. Yeah. And of course, there is the ability to learn and to move across platforms with technology, which is a type of wisdom, but that's not the thing that's emphasized. It's all a throwaway. It's all a new thing. So this idea of having a body of wisdom that is born of experience, that is of value, is just not part of the culture. And that, along with this fear, terror of death, and the fear and terror of anything that would bring you closer to death, such as being older. And I think that the culture's relationship to death is problematic in so many ways, because truly, from a Buddhist point of view, we are learning how to die as we learn how to live. And from a shamanic point of view, especially in matriarchal societies, you have this understanding, for instance, as a woman moves into menopause, that the wisdom and the creativity that she has expressed outwardly as a younger person is now being expressed internally. And she's now holding it internally and able to plumb into the mysteries of death and the unseen in a way that someone whose body is expressing externally in that creative manifestation does not. And so, there's this understanding that this is the case, and that she has therefore all of this experience and this wisdom held internally, and moving toward the confrontation with the mystery of death. And therefore, here we have this resource that we can request guidance from, right? And I think it's, I don't think people think about that. I mean, I know, I teach a class called The Initiations of the Sacred Feminine in my new book, The New Return to the Great Mother. I go into these initiatory phases that a woman's body brings her through, wherein her spiritual path is actually driven by her biology. And I've spent a lot of time with many women, helping them move through and understand, the effect of their experience of these initiations, and how, on a biological level, and how this has affected their spiritual experience. So I've spent a lot of time with people, and I can tell you, in every class I teach, everyone, all of the younger women are terrified of menopause, absolutely terrified. And I don't understand it, it's like, but I do understand it, because even in many different cultures, like there's a couple of different languages where the word for a woman who's gone through menopause is used up or no good, right? So it's not just our culture that's doing this. It's the value of wisdom, or the value of the creative power, is only valuable as long as it's producing something that is going to enhance, something on a physical level, or create domination on a physical level for the in this case, the aims of, a familiar structure dominated by males, having more children, you have more competition, more domination kind of thing. So once the woman can no longer do that, she's used up, right? And so, but the truth is that, I get it, but I think we really do need to, shift the way that we are thinking about the creative power. We're coming back to where we started. The creative power is something that cannot be harnessed, that cannot be dominated, that cannot be, well, people do their best to try to do that, but ultimately it reasserts itself in the unseen as well as in the seen. And it's a matter of us learning how to track that, and learning how to appreciate that, and learning how to receive that wisdom by understanding that that wisdom, first of all, exists, and that it is something that can be, to imagine that it's something that could be a benefit to us. So there's some thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being that embodiment of wisdom born of experience, and for sharing that wisdom with us. I appreciate it so deeply. This was extremely enriching, and I'm sure that the students in this course will find it extremely enriching as well. So thank you.
Well, many blessings to all of you in your studies and in your path.
Thank you, Isa.